The Riverside Bistro was a haven for the city's elite. Nestled in a picturesque corner overlooking the shimmering bay, the bistro exuded sophistication. Towering glass windows reflected the golden afternoon sun, while the gentle murmur of waves mingled with the soft tunes of a live violinist. Waiters in immaculate uniforms weaved through the maze of linen-covered tables, their trays laden with gourmet dishes and sparkling drinks. At the center of it all sat Jonathan Pierce, a billionaire tycoon known for his iron will and larger-than-life reputation. At 68, Jonathan carried himself with the composure of a man who had mastered the art of control. Across from him sat Vanessa, his much younger, strikingly beautiful wife. Her designer dress and diamond necklace glittered, but her attention was fixed on her phone. Beyond the patio railings, Eli, a scrappy 12-year-old homeless boy, lingered. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, unwittingly about to uncover a dark secret amidst the elegance. Eli's stomach growled as he pressed his thin frame closer to the patio railing of the Riverside Bistro. He'd been here countless times, not as a patron but as a silent observer, watching the city's wealthiest indulge in luxuries he could only dream of. His oversized hoodie hung loosely, doing little to shield him from the crisp breeze. His dark eyes darted across the tables, scanning for scraps or opportunities, until they landed on Jonathan Pierce's table. A steaming bowl of creamy chowder sat in the center, accompanied by a plate of artisanal bread. Eli's mouth watered at the sight. But his attention shifted as Vanessa, the elegantly poised woman across from Jonathan, did something that didn't match the picture-perfect scene. Her manicured fingers slipped into her designer purse, pulling out a small vial. She glanced around quickly, her expression as serene as ever, before twisting the cap open. Eli's sharp eyes caught the slight tilt of her wrist as a clear liquid dripped into the soup. She stirred it nonchalantly, her polished demeanor unshaken, then leaned closer to Jonathan. "You've been so distracted lately," she purred, her voice soft, yet cold. "After all the trouble I've gone through to make this perfect, you owe me this." Eli's heart raced. He blinked, unsure if he'd truly seen what he thought he had. The liquid had vanished into the soup as if it was never there. He crouched lower, gripping the metal railing, trying to make sense of what just happened. His gut twisted, not from hunger, but from unease. Something was wrong. Jonathan barely looked up from his phone, muttering a distracted response. Vanessa smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She pushed the bowl slightly closer to him, her perfectly manicured hand resting on the edge of the table. Eli's mind screamed for him to look away, to leave this scene behind. After all, what business did he have interfering with the lives of people like them? But as Jonathan's spoon dipped into the soup, Eli felt a surge of urgency he couldn't ignore. His fists clenched as the weight of a decision pressed on him. This wasn't his world, and he wasn't a hero. But wrong was wrong. Before he could second-guess himself, Eli vaulted over the railing and strode toward the table. His legs felt like lead, but his voice rang out, loud and cracked. "Don't eat that!" The chatter of the bistro died instantly. Heads turned, forks paused mid-air, and all eyes landed on the scrappy boy standing at the center of the polished patio. Jonathan froze, his spoon inches from his lips. He looked up, his brows furrowing in confusion. Vanessa's head snapped toward Eli, her serene mask cracking into sharp annoyance. "What did you just say?" she hissed, her voice a blade cutting through the stunned silence. Eli swallowed hard, his voice shaking but firm. "Don't eat it. She put something in your soup. I saw her." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Whispers buzzed like static as the diners processed what the boy had just said. Jonathan's gaze shifted from Eli to Vanessa, his confusion deepening into something colder. "Vanessa," he said, his tone low but sharp. "What's he talking about?" Vanessa laughed, the sound brittle and forced. "This is absurd. He's just some street kid trying to cause trouble. Look at him." Her words were venomous, but Eli stood his ground. "I'm not lying," he shot back, his voice steadier now. "I saw her pour something into your soup when you weren't looking. Check it if you don't believe me." Jonathan's hand trembled as he set the spoon down. His sharp eyes narrowed, shifting to Vanessa. "What's going on here?" Vanessa's composure faltered. Her cheeks flushed as she stammered, Are you really going to listen to him? He's probably here to scam you for money. But Jonathan wasn't convinced. The way her voice wavered, the tightness of her grip on her purse, it didn't sit right. The silence between them stretched, heavy and charged. Boy, Jonathan finally said, his tone measured. What exactly did you see? Eli took a shaky step closer. She had a bottle, like something for medicine. It was clear, and she poured it into your soup when you were on your phone. I swear I saw it. Vanessa's chair screeched as she shot to her feet. Enough of this nonsense, she snapped, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. Jonathan, eat your damn soup and let's leave. But Jonathan didn't move. His gaze bore into her, his mind piecing together weeks of unease. The air around them was electric, tension thick enough to cut. Eli felt his knees shake, but he didn't back down. Please, he urged, his voice softer now. Just don't eat it. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Jonathan pushed the bowl aside, his face hardening with resolve. Vanessa, he said quietly, what have you done? Vanessa froze as Jonathan's words hung in the air. The once lively atmosphere of the Riverside Bistro was now silent, every patron leaning in to catch what would happen next. Eli stood a few steps back, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. The weight of what he'd done sank in, but he refused to look away. Vanessa recovered quickly, her face hardening into a mask of indignation. You're actually listening to him? She snapped, her voice icy and sharp. Jonathan, he's just a street kid. He probably doesn't even know what he's talking about. Jonathan's eyes, sharp as steel, bore into her. Then you won't mind if I test the soup, he said, his voice calm but deadly serious. Vanessa's composure slipped for the briefest moment, her lips pressing into a thin line. This is ridiculous, she muttered, her voice lower now, tinged with panic. Jonathan raised a hand, signaling the waiter standing frozen nearby. Bring me a manager and a phone. We're going to settle this right now. The waiter hesitated before rushing off. Vanessa's hand gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Jonathan, this is insane, she said, leaning forward, her voice trembling with what sounded like desperation. You're making a scene. Do you really think I'd do something so vile? To you? Eli couldn't hold back. You already did, he said, his voice steady but edged with anger. I saw you pour something in. You can't lie your way out of this. Vanessa's head snapped toward him, her eyes blazing. You don't know what you're talking about, you little... Enough. Jonathan's single word silenced her. He leaned back in his chair, his hand resting on the edge of the table, as if grounding himself against the storm brewing in his mind. Vanessa, he said slowly, his voice a low rumble. For weeks I've felt something wasn't right. The arguments, the distance, the strange looks. I ignored it because I didn't want to believe it. But now, he gestured toward the boy. Now I can't ignore it anymore. The crowd around them began murmuring again, their whispers adding to the tension. Eli's heart pounded as he watched Vanessa's expression shift. The poise she'd worn so flawlessly cracked, and for the first time, there was fear in her eyes. The manager arrived, followed by the waiter carrying a phone. Jonathan stood, his commanding presence silencing the murmurs. Call the police, he said, his voice firm, and have someone test this soup. I want to know what's in it. Vanessa's reaction was immediate. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You can't be serious, she said, her voice rising. Jonathan, this is absurd. You're going to ruin my reputation over the lies of some street rat? Jonathan didn't flinch. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, he said evenly. Vanessa's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. The crowd had fully turned against her now, their faces a mix of disgust and curiosity. She grabbed her designer handbag, but before she could step away, Jonathan's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with a strength that startled even her. You're not leaving, he said, his voice low but filled with authority. Not until we get to the truth. The sound of sirens in the distance made Vanessa's shoulders tense. She yanked her wrist away, her voice breaking. This is all a misunderstanding. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. Didn't mean for what to happen? Vanessa faltered, her gaze flicking toward the soup. I just thought if you… She stopped, her words choking off as the weight of the moment crushed her resolve. The sirens grew louder, and moments later 2 police officers entered the bistro. The crowd parted for them as they approached the table. What's going on here? One officer asked, his tone neutral but commanding. Jonathan gestured toward the soup. This boy claims my wife tampered with my food. I want it tested. Vanessa's voice rose in protest. He's lying. He's just trying to cause trouble. The officer's gaze flicked to Vanessa, then to Eli. You saw something? He asked the boy. Eli nodded, stepping forward. I saw her pour something into his soup. It was a clear liquid from a small bottle. Vanessa's voice cracked as she pointed at Eli. He's making it up. He's trying to scam us. But the officer didn't respond to her. Instead, he picked up the soup bowl carefully. We'll take this for testing, he said. Vanessa's calm facade shattered. You can't do this, she screamed. But the officers were already moving. Jonathan turned to her, his face pale but resolute. Vanessa, he said quietly, it's over. And with those words, the life she'd carefully constructed crumbled before her eyes. The Riverside Bistro slowly returned to its lively hum, though the air still carried the weight of what had just unfolded. Eli stood near the table, his fists still clenched, unsure whether to leave or stay. The police officers had just escorted Vanessa out, her angry shouts fading as the door closed behind her. Jonathan sat motionless, staring at the untouched bowl of soup on the table. His usually commanding presence seemed diminished, his shoulders slumped and his face pale. He ran a hand through his silver hair, his eyes distant, as if he were replaying the betrayal over and over in his mind. Eli shifted awkwardly, glancing around. Some patrons tried to return to their meals, though their stolen glances at Jonathan betrayed their lingering curiosity. Others whispered in hushed tones, recounting the shocking events to anyone who would listen. Eli felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. He didn't belong here. He never had. Maybe it was time to slip away. Before he could turn to leave, Jonathan's voice broke through the murmurs. Eli. His tone was quiet, almost fragile, yet it carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Eli froze. Slowly, he turned back toward the table. Yes, sir, he replied, his voice barely audible. Jonathan gestured to the seat across from him. Sit. Eli hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to run, but something in Jonathan's voice compelled him to stay. He pulled the chair out cautiously and sat, his thin frame barely filling the seat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jonathan stared at the table, his hands clasped together. Then, without looking up, he said, You saved my life. Eli blinked, unsure how to respond. I couldn't let it happen, he mumbled. I saw what she did, and I knew it wasn't right. Jonathan nodded slowly, finally meeting the boy's eyes. His gaze was piercing, but there was something softer there now, a gratitude that Eli hadn't expected. Most people would have walked away, Jonathan said. They would have pretended they didn't see. But you didn't. Why? Eli shrugged, his fingers picking at a loose thread on his hoodie. I've seen too many bad things happen to good people, he admitted. I didn't know you, but I couldn't just stand there and watch. Jonathan studied the boy for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, leaning back in his chair, he asked, How long have you been out on the streets? Eli stiffened, caught off guard by the question. A while, he said vaguely, avoiding Jonathan's gaze. Jonathan frowned but didn't press. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his sleek black phone. Wait here, he said, standing up and walking a few steps away to make a call. Eli watched him warily, unsure what to expect. His pulse quickened as doubt crept in. Was Jonathan calling someone to have him removed? Or worse, arrested? Eli's stomach churned as he considered bolting, but something kept him rooted to the spot. After a brief conversation, Jonathan returned to the table. He slid his phone back into his pocket and sat down, his expression calm but firm. Help is on the way, he said simply. Help? Eli echoed, his voice wary. Jonathan nodded. I called someone I trust. They'll make sure you have a safe place to sleep tonight, somewhere warm. And if you're willing, I'd like to do more than that. Eli's eyes widened and he shook his head quickly. You don't have to do that, he said defensively. I didn't do this for money or anything. I know, Jonathan said, his tone gentle. That's why I want to help. You could have looked the other way, but you didn't. That took courage. Eli shifted in his seat, unsure of how to respond. The warmth in Jonathan's voice felt foreign, almost uncomfortable, but it was genuine. He'd spent so long being overlooked, ignored, or dismissed that he didn't know how to process kindness. Sometimes, Jonathan continued, his voice quieter now, life gives us moments to change someone else's story. You changed mine today, Eli, and maybe I can help change yours. Eli's throat tightened, and he looked down, his hands gripping the edge of the table. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, something he'd tried to bury long ago. Hope. As they sat in silence, the hum of the bistro seemed to fade into the background. Eli glanced up at Jonathan, who offered him a faint, reassuring smile. For the first time in what felt like forever, Eli allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The weight of the moment lingered between them as the hum of the Riverside Bistro began to return. Eli sat across from Jonathan, still unsure if this was a dream or reality. He had spent years being invisible, drifting through streets where no one cared to notice him. But now a man like Jonathan Pierce, a billionaire whose name was synonymous with power, was sitting in front of him, not just noticing him, but thanking him. Jonathan broke the silence first, his voice low and deliberate. Eli, do you have any family, anyone looking out for you? Eli hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the loose thread on his hoodie. No, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Not anymore. Jonathan nodded, his sharp eyes softening. I figured, he said, leaning back in his chair. It takes a certain kind of resilience to survive out there alone. But no one should have to do it, especially someone your age. Eli glanced away, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to people caring, not like this. His instincts told him this was too good to be true, that there had to be a catch. Why are you doing this? He asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. I mean, you don't owe me anything. Jonathan's expression didn't waver. Because you didn't owe me anything either, he said. But you still stepped up when it mattered most. That kind of courage is rare, Eli. It deserves to be recognized. Before Eli could respond, the bistro door swung open and a tall woman in a crisp suit walked in, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Jonathan. She approached the table with purposeful strides, her presence commanding yet warm. Mr. Pierce, she said, extending a hand. I came as soon as you called. Thank you, Linda, Jonathan said, shaking her hand before gesturing to Eli. This is Eli. I need you to help him get back on his feet. Linda turned to Eli with a kind smile, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and compassion. Eli, she said warmly, it's nice to meet you. Don't worry, we'll make sure you're taken care of. Eli stiffened, his distrust flaring up. I don't need charity, he said quickly, his voice defensive. I've made it this far on my own. Jonathan raised a hand to calm him. This isn't charity, he said firmly. Think of it as an investment. You've got potential, Eli. I can see it. All I'm offering is the opportunity to make the most of it. Eli's jaw tightened as he processed Jonathan's words. It was hard to believe in opportunities when life had shown him nothing but closed doors. But the sincerity in Jonathan's eyes was undeniable. Linda crouched slightly to meet Eli at eye level. We're not here to force you into anything, she said gently, but we can give you a place to stay, some stability. From there, it's up to you. What do you say? Eli looked between Linda and Jonathan, his chest tightening with a mix of fear and hope. I don't know, he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. I'm not used to this. People helping. Jonathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. That's understandable, he said. But think of it this way. You've spent so much time surviving. Don't you want a chance to live? Eli swallowed hard, the weight of those words sinking in. For so long, his life had been about finding the next meal, the next safe place to sleep. The idea of anything more felt foreign, almost impossible. But as he looked at Jonathan, he realized something he hadn't in years. Maybe it wasn't impossible after all. Finally, he nodded, his voice quiet but resolute. "Okay, I'll give it a shot." Jonathan smiled, relief washing over his face. "Good," he said. "Linda will take care of the details, but if you ever need anything, you call me. Understand?" Eli nodded again, his chest feeling lighter than it had in years. Linda stood and motioned for Eli to follow her. As they walked toward the door, Eli glanced back at Jonathan, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. For the first time in a long time, Eli felt something he hadn't dared to in years. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. As he stepped out into the crisp evening air, he allowed himself to believe that life didn't always have to be about surviving. It could be about living. As Eli stepped into the cool evening air, a wave of uncertainty mingled with hope. For the first time in years, the streets didn't feel as cold, and his future didn't seem as bleak. Linda walked beside him, speaking softly about next steps, a warm bed, meals, and a chance at stability. Eli only half listened, his mind racing with the possibility that life could be different. Behind him, Jonathan watched from the bistro window, his heart heavy but hopeful. Jonathan knew this encounter wasn't just about saving his own life, it was about giving Eli a chance to find his. Courage had brought the boy to the table, but kindness was what would carry him forward. In 2025, as the world becomes increasingly complex, the story of Eli and Jonathan reminds us of the enduring power of courage, empathy, and second chances. Eli's bravery in speaking up against injustice and Jonathan's willingness to offer support highlight the importance of stepping beyond our comfort zones to do what's right. It teaches us that kindness and integrity can bridge even the widest gaps between people. In a time when division often dominates, their story encourages us to look beyond appearances, embrace humanity, and create opportunities for others. Every small act of courage or generosity can ripple into profound change. Eli's courage to stand up for what's right, and Jonathan's decision to offer him a chance at a better future inspire us to reflect on our own ability to make a difference. What would you have done in their shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments. What advice would you give Eli as he takes his first steps toward a new life? Let's support Eli by celebrating his bravery and discussing ways we can create opportunities for others in need. Together, we can amplify the message that kindness and courage have the power to change lives. Your voice matters. Join the conversation.